Mr. Tony was deported from London because of the accusation of his girlfriend.
He didn't lose his life, but he lost his freedom, his future, and his home, all because of one lie from the woman he loved. His partner called 999, reporting that he's been physically and verbally abusing her. She says she's afraid for her safety. Tony stood in his own doorway, water from his recent shower still dripping down his neck, staring at two police officers who'd just shattered his world with a single sentence. Behind him, he could hear Sarah, the woman he'd planned to marry, crying to a female officer, claiming he'd threatened to kill her. It was all a lie. But in 30 minutes, Tony would be handcuffed. In 3 months, he'd be convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And in 6 months, he'd be deported from the UK, losing everything he'd built over 6 years, while Sarah and her secret boyfriend moved into his flat and enjoyed the life he'd worked so hard to create. This is the true story of how one woman's calculated betrayal destroyed an innocent man's life. 6 hours earlier, Tony wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stepped off the construction site in East London. It was nearly 8 p.m. and his body ached from 10 straight hours of laying bricks under the gray British sky. But he smiled anyway. In 3 months, he'd saved enough to put a deposit on the engagement ring he'd been eyeing at the jeweler's in Stratford. After 5 years together, he was finally ready to propose to Sarah, the woman he thought would be his wife. The tube ride home felt longer than usual that evening. Tony's mind wandered to happier times, when he'd first met Sarah at a community event in 2018, fresh off the plane from Nigeria with his work visa clutched in his hand like a golden ticket. She'd been kind then, warm, always laughing at his jokes about adjusting to British life. She'd helped him find his first flat, taught him to navigate the underground, even introduced him to her friends. But something had changed over the past year. Something dark had crept into their relationship like mold in the corners of an old house. The beginning of the end. Tony unlocked the door to their shared flat in Newham just after 9 p.m. The moment he stepped inside, he knew. The air felt electric, charged with anger waiting to explode. "Where have you been?" Sarah's voice cut through the silence before he'd even removed his work boots. "Love, same as always," Tony replied, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "The foreman had us stay late to finish the—" "Liar!" She appeared in the hallway, her face twisted with fury. "You've been with her again, haven't you? That woman from the site." Tony's heart sank. This was the 3rd time this week. The accusations had become a nightly ritual, a performance he was forced to endure without a script. "Sarah, please, there is no other woman. I've told you this. I work, I come home to you. That's all I do." He tried to keep his voice calm, gentle, the way his mother had taught him to speak to upset loved ones. But gentleness only seemed to fuel her rage. "Don't lie to me," she screamed, and suddenly her hand flew through the air, connecting with his face with a sharp crack that echoed through the small flat. Tony stood frozen, his cheek stinging. This wasn't the first time. Over the past months, the verbal abuse had escalated. First, it was insults, calling him worthless, stupid, accusing him of being unfaithful. Then came the raised voice, the screaming matches that left him hollow inside. And now, increasingly, the physical attacks. She'd shove him, throw things, slap him when he tried to defend himself. Once, she'd hurled a coffee mug that shattered against the wall inches from his head. "I'm sorry," Tony found himself saying, though he didn't know what he was apologizing for. "Please, let's just talk calmly." "Get out of my sight," she spat. "Sleep on the couch. I don't want to see your lying face." Tony retreated to the living room, his dinner growing cold on the kitchen counter, his body too tired and his heart too broken to eat. The trap tightens.
What Tony didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that Sarah's accusations weren't born of jealousy or insecurity. They were calculated, deliberate, part of a plan she'd been crafting for months with her real boyfriend, a man named Angelo. Sarah had met Angelo at her gym 9 months earlier. Unlike Tony, with his calloused hands and simple dreams, Angelo drove a flashy BMW, wore designer clothes, and promised her a life of luxury. The only problem was Tony, and more specifically, the flat they shared. The lease was in Tony's name. He'd been paying rent for 3 years before Sarah moved in. She'd contributed nothing to the deposit, nothing to the furniture, yet she'd grown comfortable in the space. And when she fell for Angelo, she didn't want to leave. She wanted Tony gone. So she devised a plan. If she could get Tony arrested, deported even, she could take over the flat, move Angelo in, and enjoy the life he'd worked so hard to create. All she needed was the right accusation. The night everything changed. It was a rainy Tuesday in November 2023 when Sarah made her move. Tony came home at his usual time, soaked from the downpour, his work clothes clinging to his tired frame. The flat was unusually quiet. Sarah was on the phone in the bedroom, her voice low and urgent. He thought nothing of it and headed to the bathroom to shower. 20 minutes later, as he dried off and changed into clean clothes, he heard knocking at the door. Loud, authoritative knocking. "Police, open up." Tony's blood ran cold. Police. His mind raced. Had something happened to someone in his family? An accident? He rushed to the door and opened it to find 2 police officers standing in the hallway, their expressions stern. "Are you Anthony O'Coffer?" "Yes, that's me. What's wrong? Has something happened?" "We're responding to a domestic violence report. We need you to come with us." "Domestic violence? I don't understand. Your partner called 999 reporting that you've been physically and verbally abusing her. She says she's afraid for her safety." Tony's world tilted. Behind him, he could hear Sarah, the woman he'd planned to marry, crying to a female officer, claiming he'd threatened to kill her. It was all a lie. But in 30 minutes, Tony would be handcuffed. In 3 months, he'd be convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And in 6 months, he'd be deported from the UK, losing everything he'd built over 6 years, while Sarah and her secret boyfriend moved into his flat and enjoyed the life he'd worked so hard to create. This is the true story of how one woman's calculated betrayal destroyed an innocent man's life. At the station, Tony tried desperately to explain. He told them about Sarah's abuse, about the slaps, the screaming, the constant accusations. He even showed them an old bruise on his arm from where she'd grabbed him 2 weeks before. But he had no proof, no photos, no recordings, no witnesses. He'd been too ashamed to tell anyone, his friends, his coworkers, even his family back in Nigeria. What would they think? A grown man being beaten by his girlfriend? Sarah, meanwhile, had come prepared. She showed the officers photos of bruises on her arms, bruises she'd given herself in the hours before calling the police. She had text messages she'd sent to friends weeks earlier, planting seeds of her false narrative. "Tony's been so aggressive lately. I'm scared." Messages her friends would now serve as evidence of an ongoing pattern of abuse. She cried, she trembled, she played the victim with such conviction that even Tony, knowing the truth, almost believed her. The Crown Prosecution Service moved quickly. Tony was charged with assault and domestic abuse. Because he was on a work visa, the charges triggered an immediate review of his immigration status. His bail conditions were clear. He could not return to the flat, he could not contact Sarah, he had to surrender his passport. Tony found himself homeless overnight, sleeping on a friend's sofa, unable to work because construction sites required ID he'd surrendered, watching his entire life in the UK crumble around him. The cruel truth revealed. 3 weeks after Tony's arrest, Sarah's plan reached its completion. The day Tony's belongings were removed from the flat, boxed up by strangers, and put into storage he could barely afford, Angelo moved in. He brought his clothes, his gaming console, his arrogance. Within hours, he was lounging on the sofa Tony had saved for months to buy, eating from the plates Tony had brought from home, sleeping in the bed Tony had once shared with the woman he loved. Sarah had won. Tony's trial came faster than he expected. His overworked public defender urged him to accept a plea deal, plead guilty to a reduced charge, accept a fine and probation, avoid jail time. "But I didn't do it," Tony insisted. "I'm innocent." "I believe you," his lawyer said, though her tired eyes suggested she'd heard similar claims 1,000 times. "But the evidence is against you. Her testimony is consistent, she has witness statements, you have your word. If we go to trial and lose, you're looking at actual prison time, and deportation is almost certain."